In order to grasp how chapter number 2 of the war panned out, keep in mind A, B, C. The alliance is defeated, however balance is restored, and then ultimately a ceasefire agreement is reached and starts negotiations. So let's first start with how the alliance was defeated. When they were first advancing south, fending off Japan, it seemed like they were on a smooth path to victory. It seemed like it was only a matter of time until they will completely fend off Japan, send them back to the seas, back to the Japanese archipelago. However, their momentum, the momentum of the alliance, was stopped in a place that is today called Ilsan, because here they meet Japanese opposition, and a huge part of their main units, the main units of the Allied forces, were completely obliterated. So, it seemed like once again momentum was on Japan's side. However, two things help restore balance. Number one, militias. What is a militia? A private army unit that is made of civilians voluntarily. Whenever there were invasions from China, Mongolia, Japan, civilians would pick up their farming tools, go deep into the mountains. Now, if you travel to Korea, you would notice that it's very hilly. There are mountains everywhere. Even the most urban areas, the biggest cities, even in those places, you would see that it's very hilly, and literally wherever you look, there will be a mountain within sight. So back then, of course, it was literally all hills and mountains. So, since 99% of the population up until the 20th century was farmers, whenever there was a big invasion, civilians would pick up their farming tools, go deep into the mountains, and start bush fighting, start guerrilla fighting. They would hide in the bushes deep in the mountains, every now and then suddenly appear, ambush the enemy's supplies, destroy their supplies, and then go back into hiding deep in the mountains. This, of course, never overpowered the enemy, but the strategy was to annoy the enemy, exhaust the enemy, and outstarve them. So, also in 1592, when there was an invasion, the civilians turned to their tactics that were passed on to them by their ancestors. They picked up their farming tools, went deep into the mountains. So, there were militias everywhere, deep in the mountains. And in one of those mountains was a general named Kwon Yul with his soldiers and a lot of civilians in a mountain called Haengju Mountain. At the time, Haengju Mountain and General Kwon Yul and of course his soldiers and the civilians in the mountain were surrounded, besieged by the Japanese army. Let's rewind a little bit. When the Allied forces were advancing south, but when they were defeated in Ilsan and their momentum stopped, that news first went to someone who most needed it, General Kwon Yul, because Kwon Yul and the Allied forces were in contact, and it was planned that when the Allied forces reach where Kwon Yul is, they would meet up, join forces, and then gain more momentum and then advance south altogether so that they can completely defeat Japan. However, as you can see here, the Allied forces never reached where Kwon Yul was because they were defeated in Ilsan. So naturally, Kwon Yul in Haengju Mountain was completely besieged by the Japanese army. They were, of course, greatly outnumbered. However, it turns out that, as a result, the victory of the Battle of Haengju goes to Korea. And there are three reasons why Korea could lead this battle to victory. Number one, weapons. Kwon Yul's unit at the time had the most advanced weapons in Korea. They had initial models of machine guns and bazookas. However, that doesn't mean that they had endless ammunition, right? They eventually ran out of ammunition, cannonballs, and arrows. And when that happened, they had to squeeze out down to the last ounce of their energy and resources. So civilians, women and children also had to fight by collecting, gathering, and delivering rocks to the soldiers on the front line so that they can throw rocks to the enemies that were trying to climb up the mountain. When civilians were collecting and delivering rocks, they used aprons, long skirts. And those aprons, long skirts, were called Hengju. That's why this mountain to this day is called Hengju Mountain, and that's why the battle of this name is the Great Battle of Hengju, to pay homage to the civilians who fought along the soldiers at the time. So reason number 1, advanced weapons. Reason number 2, Hengju. By that I mean the civilians who fought along the soldiers together. And number 3, gossip. I think the biggest fun that comes from looking into history, exploring history, comes from the fact that even though we are looking into historical events that took place a very long time ago, it still teaches us valuable lessons that we can apply to our everyday lives today. The Great Battle of Hengju teaches us a very valuable cautionary lesson, which is, don't blindly believe a rumor that was ballooned in the process of it being passed on from person to person through gossiping. Kwon Yu's unit had very advanced weapons, but it didn't mean that they had endless ammunition. They ran out of ammunition, cannonballs, and arrows. And of course the other Korean units knew that, so they wanted to deliver arrows into the Hengju Mountain. However, as you can see on land, Hengju Mountain was not approachable. It was completely besieged by the Japanese army. There was only one way they could at least approach the mountain, and that was through a river that is very close to Hengju Mountain. So they loaded arrows on ships, send those ships into the river so that they can approach Hengju Mountain and figure out a way to deliver arrows into the mountain. Now, let's zoom out just a little bit and take a look into the bigger picture. At the time of the Great Battle of Hengju, it is interpreted that Japan did not take Korea as a serious threat. They didn't even take the alliance as a serious threat. They thought that it was only a matter of time until they would win this war. However, there was one thing that Japan took seriously as a serious threat, which was Admiral Lee Sun-shin. What happened was, when Korean battleships appeared in the river, a Japanese soldier says in a jokingly way, "Hey, what if that is Lee Sun-shin? Ha ha ha," in a very jokingly way. But we know what happens when a lot of people start talking, right? Rumors are born, and they are skewed, distorted, and ballooned. So, when a Japanese soldier said, "Hey, look at those Korean battleships. What if that is Lee Sun-shin? Ha ha ha," that became, "Hey, I think that is Lee Sun-shin. I think I heard someone say Lee Sun-shin is on one of those ships." And that became, "Hey, I heard that Lee Sun-shin is here." And that became, "Hey, I heard that Lee Sun-shin brought all of his soldiers and he declared that he is willing to die here, if that means he can take all of our lives." So, by the time the rumor reached the Japanese commanders who were besieging Hengju Mountain, what happened was, one by one, they start retreating. Because at the time, there are documents that suggest that there was one thing Japan was taking seriously, which was Admiral Lee Sun-shin. Now, there are documents of orders being given between Japanese commanders, and it says, if you run into Lee Sun-shin's troops unplanned, do not engage. So, the Japanese commanders, one by one, retreat from Hengju Mountain. Now, that gave enough room and time for Kwon Yu's unit and the Allied forces to meet up gain more momentum that allowed them to push back harder. Let's take a close look. What actually happened? Were these ships that appeared in the river close to Haengju Mountain, were they actually Yi Sun-shin's ships? Were they actually Yi Sun-shin's soldiers? No. Yi Sun-shin was down south in the Southern Sea. This event teaches us a very valuable cautionary lesson. Don't blindly believe a rumor that was ballooned in the process of it being passed on from person to person through gossiping. So, at this point, it seemed like the war was going to pan out into a war of attrition. Simply an exhausting back and forth for both factions. An exhausting back and forth with no meaningful tangible gains. That's why both factions were exhausted and now starts a 3-year period of negotiations. Now, these negotiations, were they telling us that peace is on its way? Or was it just an omen that was foreshadowing even bigger tragedies? That will be talked about in chapter number 3. To sum things up, the alliance was defeated in Ilsan, so it seemed like the alliance would be completely defeated and it seemed like Japan was going to win the war. However, balance was restored thanks to militias and General Kwon Yul leading the Great Battle of Haengju into victory. Well, if we take a closer look, there were 3 reasons: advanced weapons and civilians, women and children fighting along using Haengju's aprons and long skirts, and gossiping. When Japanese soldiers said, "Hey, I heard that there's a very demonic, ruthless person named Yi Sun-shin. What if that's him? Ha ha ha." That became, over time, "Hey, I heard that Yi Sun-shin, who eats people alive, is here with all of his soldiers, and he said that he is willing to die if he can take all of us with him." So therefore, a ceasefire agreement was reached and now started a 3-year period of negotiations. Once again, do these negotiations mean that peace was on its way, or was it just an omen that was foreshadowing bigger tragedies? Well, let's figure out in chapter number 3.